Deep in the Bavarian forest, there is a town that's been around for a long, long time. And at one time, in that town, lived a young man by the name of Hans, a carpenter's apprentice. When the carpenter retired and Hans took over, he wed his betrothed, a young woman named Greta, and together they set up home, and he set up shop. By the end of the spring, Greta was with child, and that winter she went into labour, and soon gave birth to a girl to be named Gretel. But then Greta started to strain and birth a second. The effort and pain were too much, and in the last throes of the second child coming into the world, Greta faded and died. The second baby was a boy, to be named Hansel. At first he was sickly and frail, but in time he recovered. Hans, the bereaved father, grieved deeply for his lost love, but vowed to raise his children himself, and not foster one or both. Over the years, Hans was a dutiful parent and raised his children fair and well. Gretel was a strong child, quick and bright, happy and full of life. But Hansel was always a little sick, and due to the troubled birth, he bore a withered hand. Not deformed, but small and bony. Never did it strengthen as it should have, and many of the suspicious folk of the town, God-fearing as they were, believed the boy to be touched. The family lived in the house over the workshop at the end of the town. Hans continued his trade, but due to his commitments to his young children and because of Hansel's condition, he struggled to find work. By the age of 10, the children were known in the town, and despite Hansel's affliction, they were considered pretty and known to be strong and brave. Their father, though, was said to be melancholy and still mourned his beloved Greta. But they lived their lives and were often seen leaving the town to forage and even hunt in the forest, having to find food and provisions for themselves, as their wealth was not that good. The children would leave the house early and head into the dense trees, Greta leading Hansel by the hand, guarding him against those who found the need to abuse or ward off the touched child with sticks and stones. The pair would hunt for small game with traps made by their father, forage for berries and nuts, fruits and herbs, and return late in the day, laden down with their harvest. On one of those days, while hunting for ripe berries, the twins found an abandoned cottage at the side of the road, a road that had passed down many times before, but never seen the old dwelling. "Do we dare?" asked Hansel to his wiser sister. "Yes!" she beamed, dropping her sticks and fruits in favour of the strange hut at the side of the road. The curious kids took a time away from their foraging and while waiting for the traps to be sprung, and looked about the old home. It seemed as if someone had just left and never come back. The fireplace was stacked with tinder and wood, the mantel with ornaments, and there was a bed in the back room, and straw laid upon the upper floor. There were jars and pots in the cupboards, and the tables were laden with herbs and spices that seemed too fresh for the old place. "It all seems like someone is still living here, yet it looks abandoned and run down," Greta stated as she closed another cupboard. "Maybe they like it that way, so that people don't notice it. For sure, I have never noticed it before. Maybe they don't like visitors," Hansel proposed, and the pair thought about the possibility of the owner returning and catching them nosing about. So with that, the pair thought it best to leave the cottage, and hurriedly they pulled open the door and ran away from the creepy place without a look back or a need to meet the occupant. When they returned to the site on their next outing, they crept to the side of the track, hoping to spy the owner and the old house. But the house was gone, as if it had never been there, only a divot in the leaves and the mud, as if the whole building had upped and ran away. The pair was certain of the location, but the abandoned house was gone. Over the following couple of years, life became harder, and through taxes and debt, Hans found the need to seek work in surrounding towns and villages, where the knowledge of his children was not known. He started to leave the town and his children for days at a time. But one day, Hans returned with news. He'd met a widower and taken to her. He informed the children of his new betrothal and that the lady and her 2 daughters would be moving into the house soon. Hansel and Gretel were unsure what to make of the new situation. Their feelings were mixed. They were happy to hear their father had finally drawn out of his melancholy and found someone new to make him happy. But they were wary of the new family about to encroach on their life and their not-so-big house. Soon enough, the woman and her 2 daughters came to the carpenter's house at the edge of the forest town, and they moved in with force and determination. The new wife was indeed a handsome woman, rather than pretty, and was known formerly as the Lady Tremaine, her late husband's name. Her given name was Babette, but to be called mistress at all times by the children. The two girls were beautiful in face, but it was soon discovered they were dark of heart. The younger, though still older than the twins, was named Gaia, and she was round of face and body, and seemed to always be nibbling at some small food, never eating heartily. The elder was a rakish girl, thin in face and form, and was named Etta, after her mother. Life in the house became terse and tense. Fighting and shouting surpassed the calm, happy life that had existed before. The new children demanded and ordered the twins about, teasing and taunting poor Hansel. Babette would order and demand of the children, and the younger children's habits were all hindered. No longer were they allowed to go to forage in the forest, and hunting was considered vulgar, so they were forced to do the chores of the house. Life for Hansel and Gretel became a misery. The pair would often escape the house at the edge of the town and hide in the forbidden forest for the day. But returning home would bring punishment and more tasks, and their father, with his new life and his new wife, had become respected again, and his workload had become quite full. He was often in the workshop until late, or away for days, leaving his children in the capable hands of his new betrothed. It was on one of these days, when he was gone from home, that Babette called Gretel to her and handed her a bag of candle jars with a note, and ordered her to go into the woods and seek out an apothecary to replenish the lamps. Gretel tried to protest, saying that she could make them herself, but the lady of the house refused, spanking the child for daring to suggest such a thing. Gretel ran from the house, grabbing the bag and her brother, heading to the deepest part of the forest, following the map the mistress had provided. Though the children knew much of the woodland, they looked at the diagram and realised it was a part they had no knowledge of. They feared not finding their way to and from the destination. So Hansel collected rosehip berries and used them, as he had always done, to leave a trail along the path, replenishing his supply as he ran low and following the route marked on the paper. But the description was vague, often running out, turning in circles, or not showing sections of where to go, and the pair got terribly lost. More than once did they spot the red berries on the floor of the path where they had been turned around. When the sun had sunk and the trees grew too dark to see properly or to walk safely, they spotted a glowing light through the trunks. The children fought through the thicket and undergrowth and found themselves before a cottage in a clearing on the edge of a steep ravine. A long wooden walkway led to the door, and they climbed it and knocked at the door, cold, tired, and very hungry from all their travels. The cottage smelled so incredibly wonderful, like sweetbreads and cake, like entering the baker's at first light on bake day, and it just made the children hungrier. The door of the cottage opened, and there before them stood a beautiful young woman, with long pigtail braids, with a large bow in her hair, and she wore a patterned dress typical of the fashion of the area, and she smiled so pleasingly. "Welcome, young travellers of the night. What brings you to my door so late?" she asked, beckoning them in. Greta spoke up to explain their reason, how they got lost while seeking an apothecary, and the order for replacement lamps, and the tale of their journey. The young woman beamed and informed them they had found their destination, and guided them to the fire that blazed in the hearth, and sat them with blankets as she let the girls speak. Then she provided the pair with bowls of hot stew and sweet hot bread. Both children ate with speed and desire, for the food was delicious. Then she suggested the children sleep, leading them to the upper story of the high cottage, where straw mattresses covered the floor, and with their blankets still about them, they slept deep and comforting sleeps. Hansel woke in the morning, realising there was light seeping in through the roof, where a roof tile had slipped and was letting in the draught. The cottage, it seemed, was empty. The young one was nowhere to be seen. He woke his sister, and they looked about the main room of the house. On the table lay a bag of lamps filled, and a note saying to take them, and some bread for their journey. There was no mention of payment, and until then Greta had not thought of how she was meant to pay. Around the table were herbs and fruits aplenty, concoctions and mixtures, remedies in jars and pots of ointments, even nails and horseshoes, everything an apothecary could have. The pair regarded the interior, and something felt familiar to them. The ornaments on the mantel, the layout of the room, but it wasn't obvious why. The children took the bag and were ready to leave, when Hansel informed his sister that he should fix the roof as payment for the bed and food, whether the lamps had been paid for or not. The boy, though having the weak hand, had learnt much from his father and knew the task was within his abilities. So he took a few nails and a hammer he found in the hearth tools and climbed back up to the roof where they had slept, and in no time had pinned down the errant tile. While he worked, his sister turned over the note and wrote a replying message, informing the young woman of their gratitude and that Hansel had fixed the tile, and then they left. As the children exited the cottage, down the walkway, the sun shone over the roof, silhouetting the house and showing off its unusual shape, with its tall spire and turrets poking out the top, and additions to the side and back, and how it sat propped up on the edge of the steep bank. But they did not linger, and simply regarded the apothecary shop with the sign of a pestle hanging over the door, and then left. The pair tracked their path back, spotting the discarded berries, and in the light of day realising their mistakes the day before. They returned home in half the time it took of the outward journey, but the wrath of their stepmother and the pair were set about making up for their tardiness with extra chores and missions for the next weeks. Life continued this way for some time. The hardship became the norm, and when their father returned from his jobs and asked how they were, the lady of the house always stood over them with a knowing look that told them if they complained, she would punish them more with cane or more tasks, often both. So the children bit their tongue and fooled their loving father. It was deep in the middle of winter when Babette ordered the twins to return to the apothecary shop with more lamps, even though there had been enough to last twice as long. But an excuse to leave for the day was happily welcomed, and to return to the young woman's home with the delicious food was the perfect reason. The children left and gathered the small red berries on the thistle bush, for by then the rose hips were no longer in bloom. But the children gathered pockets full of the poisonous berries and set out, dropping the red balls as they travelled into the forest. After some time the children heard the song and cawing of birds, and turned to see a long path they had just travelled, filled with birds of all sizes and colours, pecking at the ground, and they realised their mistake. Though the fruits were poisonous to them, they weren't to the birds, and their path to follow in return was gone. The pair of lost children vowed to carry on to the cottage, for they had more chance of finding the apothecary than their way home, and if they dared return without the lamps filled, the lady of the house would surely beat them, no matter what the excuse. The siblings carried on, not dropping berries anymore, and the day dragged on and on. They got tired, they got hungry, and as the sun started to set on the wintry day, they found themselves at the edge of the steep ravine, but no house stood where it had before. They double-checked and remembered trees and the opening, but the house was gone. They looked down the ravine, and Hansel spotted a scuff mark, and then in the frozen, dirty and icy ground he saw familiar marks. With nothing else to do, the pair followed the churned-up ground, and after a while the kids found, in a clearing, a cottage nestled on the side of a hill. The cottage looked in shape like the apothecary, with the spire and the turrets and the large round side, but it was different. First, under the house were legs, long, spindly, like chicken legs, that may have been trunks or logs, or indeed actually the legs of a giant fowl. The limbs were stretched out down the side of the hill, but attached under the base of the house that rested atop the mound. But that wasn't all, or even the weirdest part, for the house was made almost entirely of bread, sweets, candies and sugars. The roof was hard brown gingerbread with white icing of all different designs on each tile, triangle patterns, lattice work, spots, rings, squares, diamonds and all the rest, each a different pattern, as if the owner of the house had made the bread and then decided to use them for the roofing. But that was not all. Around the windows were red and white striped candy canes. There were Battenberg tiles on the front and side, cough drops, teardrops and suckers in the window, iced sweets, fruit sweets, yellow candy, blue candy, white, pink, orange. There were sticks and popsicles, and on the spire, twisting out the top of the roof, a swirling multicoloured licorice. The children stood, stunned and silent for an age, before realising just how hungry they were, and the smell of sweet sugary foods made their stomachs lurch, and they hurried up the hill to the cottage. In their hunger their manners left them, and the pair snapped at the window ledge and reached for the roof, where it was close to the ground, and snapped off a tile of gingerbread and ate. "What are you doing to my house?" came a croaking voice from behind them as Gretel reached for a corner of the chocolate-coated door as it swung open. The children spun to see an old woman floating down to the ground from above the trees in what could only have been a giant mortar with a pestle used like a rudder of a boat to steer the bowl to the ground. The old woman clambered out and stomped to the top of the hill, then snatched a piece of chocolate door from the girl's hand. Hansel dropped the roof tile and tried to wipe away the gingerbread crumbs. "What do you think you're doing?" The old crone cackled at them as the sun cast the old woman in glowing orange light, highlighting her warted face and big eyes. We are sorry. We were lost, and we looked for the house at the ravine, but it was gone. Then we searched and searched. We are so hungry, and we've been walking around and around and around for the whole day, trying to find the apothecary owned by the young lady with the braids. But then we spied this house, and it looked the same, but so very different," Gretel explained. "We are sorry for eating your house, lady, but we are so very hungry. Is this the same house as the one? But no, it can't be. That was way back there, and the young lady with the braids was so pretty, and this is here, and you are not..." Hansel stopped himself a little too late in his explanation, realising he was about to be very rude. The old woman regarded him for a heartbeat or two, and then spoke. "Yaga, my sister, the pretty one." She almost spat at the use of the word. "She is gone for now. She'll return in the new moon. Now is my turn. What are you doing here so late in the dark days?" She barged by the girl and into the cottage. The pair of children followed and spotted a familiar interior. The large hearth, the fire blazing, the table with herbs and tools. Although the place looked a mess and dirty, as if no one had cleaned it in a moon. The old hag slumped in by the fire in a rocking chair and looked at the twins. "Our stepmother sent us to get new lamps filled. The pretty Yaga gave us plenty last time, but our stepmother sent us for more with this note." Greta handed over the paper, and the old woman took it, read it, and threw it in the fire. "Babette. That's where she's gone. My other sister has done well for herself, and now she's sent you to me. Well. Let's see. Come. She raised up from the chair and waved the children around the fireplace towards the side of the old house. Gretel looked back at her brother, shocked to hear the news of their stepmother, and beckoned him to catch up, grabbing his hand as they followed the crooked old woman. "In there, boy. Look in there. I can't reach with my old bones and my old eyes." She waved her stick that she held into the darkened room, and the girl started to lead. No, let him," she cackled, and pushed the sister back with the stick. Hansel shuffled past his sister and crouched through the low door into the room. "What is he going to look for?" Gretel asked as the young boy stepped over the threshold of the room. The old woman kicked his backside with a firm, quick step, and the boy fell into the room. Then she swung a metal gate across the opening and locked it in a flash of her hand. The room lit up as if by magic, and the old woman turned to Gretel. "Now you will work for me, and he will stay in there until I deem you have paid for the damage you did to my home. I will eat him in my stew." She poked the girl in the chest so hard she fell backwards on the floor. "What? But he fixed the broken roof last time we were here," the girl informed her. Did he? Well, then, I'll eat him the day after tomorrow, then. Give him time to fatten him up a bit." She turned and pushed the crook of her stick through the metal gate and tugged Hansel towards her. She hooked his frail arm, and he didn't have the strength to turn it loose. She pulled him to the gate and took hold of the limp wrist. "Yeah, so skinny. I need more time to add some meat to the bony creature. A week. I'll eat him in a week," she announced, turning to the girl. "And you will clean and repair the door, the window, and the roof that you broke before you eat any of my stew." "The stew? The stew that you're going to put him into? She asked, shocked and disgusted at the prospect, wondering if the food the other girl had fed them had contained the flesh of lost boys too, and was almost sick on the spot.
Get to work, girl,
the old crone yelled, pushing her stick into the girl's chest once again. Poor Gretel was forced to clean and tidy, while Hansel was trapped in what turned out to be a cage on the side of the house. The woman chained him tight up against the gate and told him to eat as much bread and cake as he could, while his sister worked. At the end of the day, the old crone shoved the girl towards the door of the prison her brother had occupied and presented her with a bowl of brown stew. She was starving, but refused to eat it for fear of its contents. Hansel sat with her, holding her hand, and passed her a few pieces of bread he'd managed to hide away in the cell. But the old woman was too vigilant and soon caught him and took away the food scraps, and the pair fell to sleep, sitting up against the metal gate. The next morning, the woman kicked her awake and told Gretel to tidy the table and clean the fireplace while she went out. Then she warned the girl not to try to free her brother, for the old woman would know, and if the gate was even touched, then Gretel would be beaten. Then she left. Immediately, Gretel set about trying to free Hansel. She pulled at the gate, she tried to jam the lock to force it, she searched for the key, with no luck, and then she tried to chip at the hinges and the walls around the gate to release the poor boy. But nothing worked, and only made it apparent she had tried and failed. When Baba returned, she studied the door, the hinge, the lock, the walls, and then turned to Gretel, and she beat the girl with her cane, one lash for each attempt. The girl slept in pain that night, whipped nearly 50 times with the old willow walking stick the woman used. Hansel, still trapped, held her hand in the only comfort he could give. After a week of cleaning, fixing, tidying and making the old cottage better, the old crone approached the jail and pulled the boy to the door. She reached out and squeezed his offered arm. Hansel let her feel the withered hand, and she groaned at the thin, bony limb. Then she swore and left the house. Gretel had given up trying to release her brother and simply sat beside the gate with him. The old woman returned some time later in the day and pulled a key from the inside of her dress, unlocked the gate and grabbed at the boy inside.
I do not have time to waste any longer. I must eat him before I leave my cottage. I will cook you tonight, boy.
Then she took the younger sibling and dragged him towards the oven on the far side of the cottage's main floor and flung open the 2 metal doors. Since the children had been trapped there, they had not once seen the old woman use the oven, and clearly she had forgotten about it too. The oven was large, and the chimney must have been one of the large turrets that rose out the top of the old house, covered in striped candy. Flinging open the metal doors, she peered inside to discover that the remnants of the last time it had been used had not been cleaned out.
Girl,
she cried in a shrill voice,
clean it now, clean it now,
and thrust Gretel at the cold oven, then returned Hansel to his caged room. Gretel complied, climbing in the cold oven and sweeping it clean of ash and tinder. Then she packed the back wall of the interior with kindling and small wood, and then the same small kindling to the side of the metal doors, and stacked logs outside beside the doors. Then she hurried about the cottage, pretending to tidy as the old witch shuffled about anxiously. The girl snatched up one of the lamp candles and took a single match and hid it in her dress, then dunked the rest of the matches in a jar of oil and replaced them, then climbed back in the oven with the candle, lamp and match in her dress.
Is my oven ready?
She asked from outside the stone hearth. All ready, but it needs a flame to start, and you will not let me have the light. You need to climb in to light it.
Fine.
The old hag cackled as she opened the doors and peered in, then hefted her dress and bent her knee to crawl inside. As Baba climbed into the great oven to get to the back wall, she moaned and growled.
Oh, why set the starter at the back, you stupid girl, you stupid. Oh, my dress is going to get dirty, you stupid.
Gretel ignored the old crone and pulled the single match from her dress and struck it on the brick interior and lit the lamp, then placed it behind the tinder wood inside the door as the old woman's legs twisted and slid deeper into the opening of the brick oven. Gretel carefully and quietly closed the metal doors behind her, lifting the large latch and watching as the tinder nearest the door caught and started to glow, and caught to the next and the next and the next, all around the base of the oven, circling the prone body. With the flames flickering and growing, she pushed the door to and then hooked it with a quiet clunk. At first, the old woman did not notice. She was so busy striking her own matches on the floor, trying and failing to make them light. Again and again she struck them, but the old matches refused to light. She finally caught a flame and lit the kindling before her as she lay on her belly on the floor of the oven, not noticing the small fires around her already building up. As the two fires grew, she realised the small pieces of wood Gretel had laid all around were catching too.
"What?"
screamed the old woman as the fire grew and grew around the edge of the brick wall, trapping her inside. Gretel stepped back and waited as the fire grew more and built. Every now and then, as the old hag screamed at a flame catching her skirt or a hand touching on the heated bricks, she would scream and spin, kick and bang the heavy door, but the latch held firm. The old woman danced in the flames, far more agile and nimble than she had shown except for the night when she shoved Hansel into the cell. Gretel watched through the grate as Baba jumped, flinched and spun away from the door. The girl took the mitt and unlatched the door, and with a quick action flung a pair of large logs in to help the fire build. The old woman screamed a murderous cry as the metal door clattered and shut and locked again. The foot of the hag kicked and rattled the door, but to no end. It held fast, and soon the yells changed from fury to agony as she felt the licks of the flames on her skin take hold. The fabric of her skirt and dress caught and burned away, and then the screams stopped and the fire caught on a new tinder. For hours Gretel sat at the cell door with Hansel and waited. The fire blazed in the oven and silence was the only sound. Scared and fearful of what she had done, the girl cried. By morning, the fire had burned out and the oven was cooling. Gretel knew what she needed to do, but as she rose from her slumber at the door of her brother's confinement, the cottage shuddered and shook, violently rocking. The children clung to each other as best they could as the herbs in the racks rattled and the ointments in the shelves clanked and the tools in the rack banged about and the house lurched. It seemed the whole building moved. Struggling to her feet, Greta moved against the rocking of the house and flung open the front door to discover she and it were no longer on the hilltop, but the cottage was walking through the forest. Those long, spindly legs were stomping through trees and following along the edge of the ravine once more. The cold, bright day outside moved past, the ground far below. Hansel called to her asking what was happening, and she hurried to him to share the news. Then, as quickly as it started, the cottage stopped its movement and slumped to a halt once more. Gretel returned to the door to find the view once more had changed. The cottage had resumed its seat on the banks of the ravine, in a new spot that she did not recognise, and settled down once again. The girl turned to the large open room and the task that she had been about to set upon, the gruesome task that she needed to complete. She moved to the large oven and swung open the door and peered inside. The interior was a warm glow, embers of the cooking all that remained, apart from the pile of ash, a few charred bones, and a mound of fat. With a scarf about her mouth and a scraping tool in her hand, the girl dragged the mound of burned flesh from the floor of the oven out and into a large trough with a mesh grill across the top. As the fat and ash slopped with a grotesque slop into the bucket, small bones and other objects started to rest in the mesh. Gretel heaved the remains, trying to hold in what little food remained in her stomach as she performed the vulgar task. As she sluiced out the main lump of burnt hag into the bucket, a deluge of objects fell into the mesh. Stones and coins, jewels and coins, and a necklace containing three small vials with stopper lids. One was smashed, a second was whole, but the lid pulled out, but the third miraculously remained whole. A green liquid sloshed about inside the singed glass. On the chain was the object she needed, a single old iron key. With tentative fingers, she lifted the chain from the pile of bounty left from Baba's secret stash and took it to the metal gate. She slid the key in and click. The door swung open with a scratchy sound, and Hansel hurried out, leaving the chain, the bottles and the key within the lock. "Come on, let us be gone from this place." Gretel suggested, and the pair hurried to the door that remained open from the move. Hansel and Gretel jumped across the threshold and the gap at the top of the ravine and onto the path outside and onto the path alongside the slope of the forest, relieved to feel the cool morning air on their skin and ready to run and never return. "Good morning, Gretel, isn't it? And Hansel." The pair froze at the sound of the sweet voice and slowly turned. Before them stood the pretty young woman with the long braids. On that morning she wore a long, heavy dress with a fur mantle upon the shoulders and a large red bow in her hair. She looked beautiful, but the children, having realised her to be the sister of the old woman they had cooked in the oven the night before, feared for their lives. "I see you left the cottage just then. Has my sister vacated it already? I still see her pestle sat aside the door, and she travels nowhere except within it." Gretel looked at her brother to think of an answer, but before the answer came to her, the cottage shuddered, for no other word would suffice, for it shook, and no longer covered in candy and gingerbread, breads and sugars. Instead, the same old house with the turrets and the tall spires, but made of simple, real wood and stones, remained. "Oh!" the beautiful Yaga exclaimed, and looked back at the children, puzzlement colouring her face. "Oh, it seems Baba has vacated the house, and the house is mine once more. How odd! Come, we should breakfast. It is far too early and too cold to leave just yet." And the woman led the pair back inside the house. Inside was as it had been, all tidy, save for an odd bottle overturned here or there at the far end of the room, the oven doors standing open, and a bucket of fat and bone before it. Yaga moved with purpose to the oven and looked down at the trough, then suddenly turning to the children regarded them and the pile of burnt flesh. Did you... Oh, what happened? You will tell. And the children did tell, whether from some compulsion or from some need to tell the truth. They told it all, from getting lost in the woods and the berries eaten by the birds to finding the cottage and Baba. They told of their stepmother and Baba saying she was her sister also, to which the pretty Yaga simply scrunched her nose and waved them on. They told of Hansel being pushed into a cell and how the old woman felt his withered arm and made Gretel clean and tidy, and how in the end she threatened to cook Hansel in the oven. And then Gretel told how she set the fire to catch and added logs and listened as Baba burned. Surprisingly, the last revelation did not bring wrath from the sister, but glee, merriment even. A smile, so pretty but so wicked, spread over her lips, and then she smiled and laughed and danced. She actually danced around the room at the news. "She's dead! She's dead! She's dead! Yay! I have my house back. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, you poor children, you had to suffer and you had to do all that. I must thank you and bless you for all you have done, you sweet, sweet children." She sang around the house as the children watched on in confusion. After many, many more cheers and songs, the young woman finally explained to the confused pair. It seemed the three sisters all lived in the house, sharing it once at a time. While one occupied it, the others could not enter. A spell made by the eldest and greediest, Babette, had left many years before, giving up her right to the cottage's time, and meaning the cottage remained empty for a period each moon. But under Baba's use, the house was a cauldron of evil, a place to trap and torture children, and there was nothing the youngest sibling could do to stop it. Just take it back each turn and clean and banish the negative energy within, setting free the spirits of the poor tormented children. The cottage Baba frequented only existed for Baba. Yaga's apothecary was as they saw it, and Babette's version the discarded ruins. The young woman looked about the home, seeking out the interior, and the key in the lock and the chain hanging from it. Oh my, that was lucky," she exclaimed, picking up the little bottle tentatively from the chain, and then seeing it was still intact, pulled the key free and looked at the other bottles. "Oh, it would seem that you will be grieving a loss too." The children didn't understand the reference. "Well, let's see." The young lady led the children from the shop. When they looked back at the cottage, they saw it full clearly in the daylight. Though it was the same cottage in shape and design, the turrets and spires remained, and a sign above the door with a symbol of the apothecary, a pestle and mortar. The twisted spire on the highest part of the roof swirled around and seemed to be still covered in vines of coloured sugar canes, just as it had as Baba's home. "Come on then," the young female called, starting off along the ravine towards the morning sun. Gretel took Hansel's hand and tugged him to run after the apothecarist. The trio walked and talked and gained knowledge of each other. Gretel told their story and spared no detail of how she tripped the old hag into the fire. Yaga seemed fascinated and even giggled at the end of the tale, and then she told her side. Each new moon the cottage was passed to her for her to occupy and run the shop. Known throughout the forest region, many came to buy in the 10 days of the shop opening, but then on the 11th she had to leave and give over the cottage, and it fell once more into dilapidation as Babette cared not for it and left it to ruin wherever it had walked to. 10 days on, and Baba would find the cottage and set about her evil tasks. And so it had been since the 3 sisters had been the owners of the cottage. Baba's ritual had tricked the other pair by trapping their essence in the vials that she wore at all times around her neck. But Gretel's plan to get the key and kill the evil eldest sibling had set Yaga free, and with the telling, the young woman took the green bottle from her pocket and without pause uncorked it. The vapour-like essence swirled and lifted from the opening, and she sucked at the gasiness and drew it into her mouth, then shuddered and staggered, but righted herself and beamed a rosy-cheeked smile, seemingly more beautiful, more sparkle in her eyes and happier. She discarded the bottle and then skipped and spun as she had upon hearing her sister's demise. At that moment a voice echoed hers. A cry, muffled in trees, whispered, "Gretel? Hansel? Oh, where are my children? Children!" The voice called again, and the man appeared between the trees and staggered wearily on the path. "Father!" screamed the twins and ran to the man. "Children, where have you been? I've been looking for you for the whole day. I was sure you were lost to me for good, but here you are." "How did you find us?" Hansel asked, hugging the man. "Babette, your stepmother, she died this morning. She screamed and withered and fell to the floor, and in that moment I felt nothing for her and realised that you were missing. It was as if I had not noticed your absence until that moment. Her daughters are mourning their mother, but they too left the house, returning to their old home. But I felt the need to come looking for you. I am so very sorry for not realising you were missing for... How long has it been? I don't understand what has happened." "That will be the spell my sister cast on you. It is not the first time she's used the trick of a fog on a man, but thanks to Gretel, it will be the last," announced the young woman behind them. The children's father looked up at the woman in the clearing, taken aback by the beauty. "You are?" the man stammered at the sight of the woman. "I am Yaga, half-sister to your wife, Babette. I fear she used your grief to take control of you and intended to steal your life, money, and send your children to their death at the hands of my other sister, Baba. But your resourceful daughter beat her at a game, and now we are both free." Hans stood and bowed to the woman, clearly taken aback at the resemblance she bore of her older sister that had won over his attentions, but was far prettier. "Come, let us return to my shop for food, rather than return to the house empty of Babette and her tricky daughters." And without waiting, Yaga spun on their heels and headed back the way they had come, and Hans followed, seemingly eager to not let the beautiful woman out of his sight. Pulling his children's hands, the trio followed her along the ravine path back to the colourful cottage. The man chatted eagerly as they walked, and by the time they returned to the steps leading to the stranger's cottage, the pair of adults were conversing and falling truly in awe and intrigue with one another. The group broke their fast and ate a healthy and hearty meal with the young woman with the bow in her hair, and the children helped clean up while the man helped by climbing onto the roof and fixing the damaged tiles his son had not fixed fully the last time he had visited the apothecary. They stayed in the shop cottage that day and slept the night. Then the next day the shop rose up and walked to a new location, and the family stayed, and in the end, well past the 10 days that Yaga usually had the cottage. They stayed well past the moon, well past the year in fact, and it was after that year that the house moved on again, and Hans and Yaga announced that she was pregnant, and the family settled the house once more and opened the shop for the customers of the apothecary and the carpenters, and the children helped with them both. The
End.